In 1944, inside a prison camp surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, a British soldier named Richard Radford watched something strange happen. A man traded his entire week's bread ration for 7 cigarettes. Not because he was crazy, not because he had a death wish, but because in that moment, those 7 cigarettes were worth more than food itself. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was economics at its rawest form, stripped down to pure human need and desire. And it was happening in prison camps, concentration camps, and frontline trenches across the entire war. Traditional money, the stuff governments printed and people trusted, had become about as useful as wet newspaper. German marks, Italian lira, even American dollars, they couldn't buy you safety, they couldn't buy you food, and they sure as hell couldn't buy you a way out. The collapse started quietly. When soldiers got captured and thrown into POW camps, they arrived with whatever cash they had stuffed in their pockets. Some guys had 20 bucks, others had nothing. But within days, everyone realized the same brutal truth. Money only works when there's something to buy, when willing to sell. Inside those camps, surrounded by enemy guards and barbed wire fences, your dollar bills might as well have been toilet paper. Actually, toilet paper would have been more valuable. The German guards didn't want your money. They had their own currency, and it was already losing value faster than ice melts in summer. The camp stores, if they even existed, had nothing on the shelves. No chocolate bars, no extra socks, no letters home, just empty promises and ration tickets that guaranteed you barely enough calories to stay alive. So the prisoners did what humans have done for thousands of years when official systems collapse. They improvised. At first, it was pure barter, simple trades between men who had different things and different needs. A guy from Brooklyn who hated jam might trade his Red Cross jam ration to a farm kid from Iowa who grew up on the stuff. Fair trade. Both happy. But barter has a problem, a big one. You need what economists call a double match of wants. You need to find someone who has exactly what you want and wants exactly what you have at the exact same time. And in a camp with thousands of men, that's like finding a needle in a haystack while blindfolded. Let's say you wanted chocolate but only had soap to trade. You'd wander around the barracks yelling, "Soap for chocolate." But maybe nobody with chocolate wanted soap. Maybe the chocolate guy wanted butter. So now you had to find someone with butter who wanted soap. Trade soap for butter, then trade butter for chocolate. 3 trades just to get one candy bar. Exhausting, inefficient, frustrating as hell. The prisoners needed something better, something everyone wanted, something that could act as a middleman for trades. They needed money, real money. Not the paper garbage their governments printed, but something with actual value inside the camp walls. And then, almost like magic, the answer arrived in the form of Red Cross parcels. Those parcels were lifelines. They showed up every week or two, shipped from Switzerland, packed with food, supplies, and most importantly, cigarettes. Not just a few cigarettes, we're talking packs of them. American cigarettes, British cigarettes, sometimes even Canadian brands. And suddenly, every prisoner had access to the same supply of the same product at the same time. That's when everything changed. Because cigarettes had something special. They were small, easy to carry, easy to count, easy to split up. You could trade 1 cigarette or 5 or a whole pack. They didn't rot like food. They didn't rust like tools. And almost everyone either smoked them or knew someone who did. Demand was built right into the product itself. Nicotine addiction is a hell of a salesman. Within weeks, cigarettes stopped being just something you smoked. They became the thing you used to buy everything else. Bread cost 5 cigarettes, a tin of jam, 7 cigarettes, a chocolate bar, maybe 10 if supply was low. Even services started getting priced in smokes. Want someone to wash your clothes? 2 cigarettes. Need a haircut? 3 cigarettes. The entire camp economy reorganized itself around a currency nobody planned, nobody authorized, and nobody could stop. And it wasn't just the prisoners using cigarettes as money. The guards figured it out too. German soldiers, tired, underpaid, and watching their country lose the war, started accepting bribes in cigarettes instead of worthless paper marks. Need a letter smuggled out? 10 cigarettes. Want an extra blanket before winter? 15 cigarettes. Information about when the Allies might arrive? That'd cost you a whole carton. Cigarettes became more than money. They became power. The guys who saved their smokes instead of smoking them could buy better food, better clothes, better treatment. The guys who chain smoked everything they starved. It was ruthless Darwinian economics playing out in real time. and nobody was coming to bail anyone out. This same pattern repeated itself across hundreds of camps from Germany to Italy to France. British POWs used cigarettes. American POWs used cigarettes. Even in the horrific concentration camps where survival was measured in days, cigarettes became the currency of last resort. Because when everything else fails, when governments collapse and systems break down, humans always find a way to create order from chaos. And in World War II, that order was built on smoke. The rise of smoke. The story of cigarettes becoming currency didn't start in the prison camps. It started way before that in military supply chains and government decisions that nobody thought twice about at the time. Back in World War I, soldiers got 4 cigarettes a day as part of their rations, not because the military cared about their lungs, but because commanders believed tobacco kept men calm, alert, and ready to fight. By World War II, that number had tripled. American soldiers in the 1940s received 12 cigarettes every single day. 4 cigarettes came with breakfast in their K ration pack, 4 more at lunch, 4 at dinner, before toilet paper, before extra socks, before a lot of things most people would consider basic necessities. Soldiers got cigarettes. The US military treated tobacco like fuel for the war machine, something absolutely essential to keeping men operational under the worst conditions imaginable. And it wasn't just Americans. British troops got cigarette rations. German soldiers got cigarettes when supply lines allowed it. Soviet troops traded for them whenever possible. Every army in the war understood the same basic truth. Soldiers under stress need something to take the edge off. And cigarettes, for better or worse, did exactly that. They gave men something to do with their hands during the endless hours of waiting. They provided a brief chemical comfort when everything around them was exploding. And they created a shared ritual that bonded men together in the foxholes. But there was another reason militaries loved cigarettes. They were easy to transport. Unlike beer, they didn't weigh much. Unlike hot food, they didn't spoil. Unlike weapons, they didn't need maintenance. You could drop a carton of cigarettes from a plane, and as long as the pack didn't land in water, the smokes would be fine. For supply officers trying to keep millions of men equipped across entire continents, cigarettes were a logistical dream. The tobacco companies, of course, loved this arrangement. Philip Morris, Lucky Strike, Camel, they all ramped up production to meet military demand. And they didn't charge full price either. The military got cigarettes at massive discounts, sometimes pennies per pack. This wasn't charity, this was marketing genius. Get millions of young men addicted to your product during the war, and they'll keep buying it when they come home. The tobacco industry called it patriotism. Financial analysts called it the best investment in customer loyalty ever made. For soldiers on the front lines, cigarettes quickly became more valuable than their pay. A private in the US Army made about $50 a month. But where the hell were you going to spend that in a trench in France or a jungle in the Pacific? There were no stores, no restaurants, no anything. Your paycheck was just numbers on paper that might matter someday if you survived. But cigarettes? Cigarettes were real. Cigarettes were now. And cigarettes could get you things you actually needed. The trading started small. A soldier who didn't smoke might trade his cigarette ration to a buddy for an extra can of rations. Simple swap. Both guys happy. But as the war dragged on and supply lines got stretched thin, those trades got more complex. Guys started hoarding cigarettes like they were saving money in a bank. They'd skip smoking for weeks, building up a stash, because they knew that stash could buy them safety, comfort, or survival when things got desperate. In the Pacific Theater, where American troops fought in brutal island campaigns, cigarettes became the unofficial currency for dealing with locals. Need fresh water? Trade cigarettes. Want someone to guide you through the jungle? Cigarettes. Need information about Japanese positions? You better have a carton ready. The locals didn't want American dollars. They wanted something they could actually use or trade themselves. And cigarettes fit that bill perfectly. The same thing happened in Europe. When American and British troops moved through Italy and France, civilians swarmed them begging for cigarettes. Not food, not money, cigarettes. Because cigarettes could be traded for food, they could be traded for shelter, they could be sold on black markets for real value. An Italian farmer in 1944 couldn't do much with a $5 bill, but he could trade a pack of Lucky Strikes for bread, cheese, and wine. Even among the troops themselves, a hierarchy formed based on who had access to cigarettes. Supply officers, the guys who controlled the flow of goods, could get cigarettes easier than frontline soldiers. They'd sell or trade them at a markup, running informal businesses right inside the military structure. Some officers made more money from cigarette trading than they did from their actual military salary. And the army, stretched thin and fighting on multiple continents, mostly looked the other way because honestly, they had bigger problems. But the real transformation, the moment cigarettes fully became currency instead of just trade goods, happened when soldiers got captured. Because once you ended up behind enemy barbed wire, your connection to the normal world severed completely. No more paycheck, no more supply drops, no more anything except what the enemy decided to give you and what the Red Cross managed to sneak through. And that's when cigarettes stopped being a convenience and became the only economic system that mattered. The perfect currency. Money is a strange thing when you think about it. It's just paper or metal or numbers on a screen. It has no real value by itself. You can't eat it, you can't build shelter with it, you can't use it to stay warm, but we all agree to pretend it has value. And because we all agree, it works. That social agreement is what makes money function. And in the prison camps of World War II, that agreement formed around cigarettes faster than anyone expected. Economists have a checklist for what makes something good money. It needs to be durable, so it doesn't fall apart before you can spend it. It needs to be divisible, so you can make change. It needs to be portable, so you can carry it around easily. It needs to be recognizable, so nobody argues about what it is. And most importantly, it needs to be scarce, but not too scarce, and desired, but not too desired. Cigarettes checked every single box. Durability wasn't perfect, but it was good enough. A cigarette could last weeks if you kept it dry. Sure, they could get crushed or damp, but so could paper money. And unlike food, which rotted, or soap, which dissolved, cigarettes stayed usable for a long time. Guys learned to store them carefully, wrapped in cloth or tucked into tins, treating them like the valuable assets they'd become. Divisibility was brilliant. One cigarette was the basic unit. Want to buy something small? Trade one cigarette. Something bigger? Trade a pack of 20. Something really expensive? Trade a whole carton. You could make exact change down to the single smoke, which meant transactions could happen smoothly without the arguments that barter always caused. No more, I'll give you this tin of jam for that chocolate bar, but the chocolate bar's bigger, so you owe me something extra. With cigarettes, everything had a clear price. Portability was obvious. Cigarettes weighed almost nothing. A pack fit in your pocket. A carton could be carried under one arm. Compared to trading tins of food or bars of soap, cigarettes were featherlight. This mattered in camps where men moved barracks, got transferred, or had to hide their wealth from guards or other prisoners. You couldn't hide a week's worth of bread rations, but you could absolutely hide a week's worth of cigarette savings. Recognition was universal. Every brand had a reputation, but they were all close enough in value that trading worked smoothly. A Lucky Strike and a Camel weren't exactly the same, but they were close enough that people didn't argue. It was like the difference between a dollar bill from one bank versus another. Sure, there might be tiny differences, but money is money. And in the camps, smokes were smokes. But the real genius of cigarette money, the thing that made it truly perfect for prison camp economics, was the built in demand from addiction. Most soldiers in World War II smoked. The military had made damn sure of that by handing out free cigarettes for years. These guys were hooked on nicotine, physically dependent on it. They needed cigarettes the way they needed food and water, and that need created a floor under the currency's value. Think about it like this. Modern government currencies work because citizens need them to pay taxes. You can't pay your taxes in chickens or gold or Bitcoin. You need dollars or euros or whatever your government demands. That requirement creates baseline demand that keeps the currency valuable. In the POW camps, addiction created the same effect. Smokers needed cigarettes to function, to stay calm, to avoid withdrawal, so they'd always accept cigarettes as payment because they knew they'd always need them. Non-smokers figured this out fast. If you didn't smoke, you had a massive economic advantage. Every cigarette you received in your Red Cross parcel was pure profit. You could save them, invest them, and used them to buy extra food or trade for services. The non smokers became the merchant class, the bankers, the wealthy elite of the camp economy. Meanwhile, the heavy smokers, the guys who couldn't save because they burned through every cigarette they got, stayed poor. Some smokers got so desperate they'd trade next week's rations for cigarettes today. It was predatory lending played out with tobacco instead of money. They'd promise to give you their bread when parcels arrived in exchange for cigarettes. Now. And if parcels got delayed, they'd starve while still owing debts. The camp guards noticed this happening so often that some camps banned trading German rations because too many prisoners were literally smoking themselves to death. There was even something like inflation and deflation in the cigarette economy. When Red Cross parcels arrived regularly, cigarette supply was high and prices for goods dropped. You could buy a tin of jam for 5 cigarettes instead of 7. But when parcels got delayed, maybe because Allied bombing hit the supply roads, or because the German guards stole the shipments, cigarette supply crashed. Suddenly, that same tin of jam cost 12 cigarettes because there were fewer smokes in circulation. War news affected prices too. When rumors spread that the Allies were advancing and the camp might get liberated soon, cigarette prices would spike. Why? Because men started hoarding cigarettes to use as currency when they got freed, knowing they could trade them to German civilians or use them to bribe guards for better treatment during the final chaotic days. Good news meant uncertainty, and uncertainty made people hold on to their money. Bad news, like hearing about a major German victory, had the opposite effect. If it looked like the war would drag on for years, cigarette prices stabilized because men figured they'd be stuck in camp long enough that normal economic cycles would matter. It was market psychology playing out in real time, driven by information, fear, hope, and the universal human need to feel like you had some control over your fate. And here's the darkest part. Cigarettes were deflationary by design. Every time someone smoked a cigarette, that cigarette disappeared from the economy permanently. It was destroyed, burned up, gone. This meant the total supply of cigarettes gradually decreased between Red Cross deliveries, making the remaining cigarettes more valuable. Some prisoners even joked that cigarettes were better than gold because at least cigarette supply couldn't suddenly explode. It was naturally controlled by consumption and destruction. But that deflation created a brutal trap for addicted smokers. If you smoked 10 cigarettes today, you weren't just losing today's purchasing power, you were making tomorrow's cigarettes more valuable by reducing supply, which meant your future self would be even poorer relative to everyone else. It was an economic death spiral that played out on thousands of men who couldn't quit smoking, even when it meant slow starvation. The prisoners who understood economics had a massive advantage, and one of them, a British economist named R.A. Radford, was taking notes. He watched the entire system develop from simple barter to complex cigarette-based finance, and when the war ended, he'd write about it in a paper that would become legendary in economics textbooks. But first, he had to survive it, the POW camp economy. R.A. Radford was a British soldier and a trained economist. When he got captured by German forces and thrown into a prisoner of war camp in Bavaria, most men would have focused on survival, on getting through each day without losing their minds or their lives. But Radford did something different. He watched. He documented. He turned his imprisonment into the most detailed real-time study of how human economies form under extreme conditions. The camp he ended up in was called a Stalag, a German POW camp for non-German military personnel. It held thousands of prisoners from multiple countries: British, American, Canadian, Australian, even some Polish and French soldiers. Different languages, different cultures, different preferences. But they all shared the same harsh reality. They were trapped behind barbed wire with barely enough food to survive, totally cut off from the outside world except for occasional Red Cross parcels. Those parcels were everything. They arrived every week or two, depending on whether supply lines were intact. Each parcel contained roughly the same contents: tinned milk, jam, butter, biscuits, canned meat, chocolate, sugar, tea, and cigarettes. The parcels were standardized, which was crucial. It meant every prisoner received approximately the same goods at approximately the same time. That uniformity created the foundation for the economy that would develop. At first, trading was chaos. The day parcels arrived, men would storm through the barracks yelling offers. Cheese for 7, meaning they'd trade their cheese ration for 7 cigarettes. Chocolate for jam. Someone else might shout back, jam for butter. It was verbal market bedlam, voices overlapping, deals happening in real time, no organization, no structure, just desperate men trying to swap what they had for what they wanted. This system sucked. It was loud, confusing, and inefficient. Deals fell through because people couldn't find each other. Prices fluctuated wildly because nobody knew what anyone else was paying. And there was constant arguing about whether trades were fair. Plus, you had to be present and yelling to participate. If you were sick or on work detail or just too exhausted to shout over the crowd, you missed out entirely. So the prisoners, ingenious as desperate people tend to be, created something better. They set up an exchange and mart notice board in every barracks. It worked like a primitive stock exchange. You'd write your offer on a piece of paper and pin it to the board. Have 1 tin jam. Want 7 cigarettes. Someone interested would take down your note, find you, and make the trade. The board stayed up all day, updating constantly, creating a visible marketplace that everyone could access. This changed everything. Suddenly, prices became public information. Everyone could see what goods were trading for at any moment. If someone tried to rip you off, offering 3 cigarettes for jam when the board clearly showed jam was going for 7, you could call them out. The transparency forced prices toward equilibrium, the natural market rate where supply and demand balanced out. Economists call this price discovery, and it was happening in real time in a prison camp. The notice boards also allowed for more complex trades. You could post have 2 tins meat, want 1 chocolate and 3 cigarettes. Someone might counter with a different offer. The board became a negotiation space, not just a one-time yelling match. And because everything was written down, people could plan ahead, think about trades, and make more rational economic decisions instead of impulse swaps driven by parcel day excitement. Cigarettes quickly dominated the notice boards as the pricing standard. Instead of jam for cheese, posts read jam for 7 cigarettes and cheese for 8 cigarettes. This shift was subtle but massive. It meant people were thinking in cigarettes first, treating them as the unit of account, the measuring stick for value. If you wanted to know whether jam or cheese was more valuable, you didn't need to find someone trading them directly. You just compared their cigarette prices. Cheese cost 8, jam cost 7. Therefore, cheese was more valuable. Simple math. Some prisoners became professional traders. They'd buy goods when prices were low and sell when prices were high, making a profit in cigarettes. These guys were running arbitrage operations, exploiting price differences between barracks or between different times of day. One trader might notice that chocolate was cheap in Barrack A, but expensive in Barrack B. He'd buy chocolate in A for 10 cigarettes, walk over to B, and sell it for 13 cigarettes. 3 cigarette profit for 10 minutes of walking. Do that enough times, and you could build serious wealth. The camp even developed a version of credit and loans. If someone desperately needed cigarettes today but had no goods to trade, they might borrow cigarettes from a wealthier prisoner with the promise to repay when next week's parcels arrived. The lender would charge interest, usually 1 or 2 extra cigarettes, depending on the risk. If parcels got delayed and the borrower couldn't repay, the debt rolled over with even more interest. Some prisoners ended up in cigarette debt spirals that lasted months. Radford documented all of this with the precision of a scientist watching bacteria grow in a petri dish. He noted that prices fluctuated based on supply disruptions, war news, and even the weather. When air raids hit nearby and prisoners thought they might get killed before liberation, cigarette prices spiked as men tried to cash out their savings for immediate pleasure or survival goods. When rumors of peace spread, prices stabilized as optimism returned. He also noticed that different prisoner populations valued different goods. British soldiers loved tea and would pay premium cigarettes for extra rations. Americans preferred coffee and chocolate. French prisoners valued wine and cheese from parcels more than others did. This created trade opportunities between groups. A Brit could trade his coffee ration to an American for extra tea, and both would end up happier. The cigarette economy allowed these cross cultural trades to happen smoothly because everyone agreed cigarettes were neutral, universal value. The guards watched all of this with a mix of amusement and greed. German soldiers stationed at the camps were poorly paid, often hungry themselves, and watching their country collapse around them. They wanted in on the cigarette economy too. Prisoners quickly learned that guards would accept bribes and cigarettes for small favors. Want a letter smuggled out to the Red Cross? 10 cigarettes. Need medical supplies? 15 cigarettes. Want advance warning if the camp is about to be moved? That'd cost you a full carton, 50 cigarettes. This created a strange secondary economy where prisoners essentially paid taxes to the guards in cigarette form. The guards had power. They controlled access to the outside world, to better food, to survival itself. And they accepted cigarettes as payment for that power because they could either smoke them themselves or trade them to German civilians who were desperate for tobacco as their own economy collapsed. Cigarettes flowed from prisoners to guards to civilians in a chain of economic need that transcended national boundaries. Radford also noticed something darker. The cigarette economy created winners and losers within the prisoner population. The winners were non smokers with strong willpower, traders with sharp instincts, and anyone who got extra parcels through luck or connections. The losers were heavy smokers, men with no trading skills, and anyone unlucky enough to have their parcels stolen or delayed. The gap between rich and poor prisoners grew over time, measured entirely in cigarette wealth. Some prisoners accumulated hundreds of cigarettes, stored carefully, never smoked. These men ate better, dressed warmer, and had more social influence. Other prisoners had nothing, smoking every cigarette the moment they got it, constantly hungry, constantly desperate. And here's the brutal truth. In some camps, the wealthy prisoners lived. The poor prisoners died. Not from executions, but from malnutrition exacerbated by economic inequality within the camp itself. Radford wrote all of this down on scraps of paper he hid in his bunk. When the Allies finally liberated his camp in 1945, he walked out carrying a complete economic record of prison camp life. Within months, he published it in an academic journal called Economica under the title, The Economic Organization of a POW Camp. It would become one of the most famous economics papers ever written, taught in universities for decades, as a perfect example of how money emerges naturally from human interaction, even under the worst conditions imaginable. But Radford's camp was relatively humane compared to what was happening in other parts of the Third Reich, because while POWs were building cigarette economies to buy extra jam and chocolate, millions of others were using cigarettes to buy something much more desperate: the chance to survive one more day, the dark side of smoke money. The concentration camps were hell on earth. They were not prisoner of war camps. They were extermination facilities. Places specifically designed to strip people of their humanity, work them to death, or kill them outright. The prisoners there weren't soldiers protected by the Geneva Convention. They were Jews, political prisoners, homosexuals, Roma, anyone the Nazi regime deemed undesirable. And they lived under conditions so brutal that comparing them to POW camps is obscene. But even in hell, economics exist because humans, no matter how degraded, no matter how desperate, still trade, still scheme, still try to find tiny advantages that might mean the difference between dying today or surviving until tomorrow. And in the concentration camps, cigarettes weren't just currency. They were power. They were hope. They were literally the difference between life and death. Cigarettes in camps like Auschwitz didn't come from Red Cross parcels. Most prisoners got nothing. Zero. They were expected to die, so why waste resources on them? But some prisoners had special status. Capos, prisoner functionaries who supervised work details and enforced discipline, received small rations that sometimes included tobacco. These capos, often criminals or political prisoners selected by the SS, wielded enormous power. They could make your work assignment easier or harder. They could beat you or protect you, and they accepted bribes and cigarettes. Where did regular prisoners get cigarettes to bribe capos? Mostly from the few prisoners who worked outside the camp fences. Some were assigned to labor details in nearby towns or factories. There, if they were extremely lucky and extremely careful, they might trade with civilian workers. A slice of bread stolen from a factory might get traded to a Polish civilian for a single cigarette. That one cigarette, smuggled back into camp, hidden in clothing or body cavities, became worth more than gold. One cigarette could buy an extra piece of bread from a capo. That bread could keep you alive long enough to survive another selection, another day. Two cigarettes might get you a better work assignment, something indoors instead of brutal outdoor labor that killed men within weeks. Five cigarettes could possibly get you medicine, actual medicine, aspirin, or bandages smuggled in by camp workers who had access to infirmary supplies. These trades happened in shadows, whispered negotiations where both parties knew that discovery meant immediate execution. The SS guards knew about cigarette trading and mostly looked the other way as long as it didn't interfere with the camp's primary purposes. Some guards even participated, accepting cigarettes as bribes from prisoners desperate for favors. This created a horrific economic chain. A prisoner might trade a gold tooth pulled from their own mouth to a guard for two cigarettes. Those two cigarettes could then be traded to a capo for a better bunk assignment, away from prisoners with typhus. The better health from avoiding disease could mean surviving long enough for liberation. Stefan Kaczynski, who survived Auschwitz, later described keeping cigarettes even though he didn't smoke. It's like money, he explained. With it, I could buy a little margarine, some bread, some potatoes. Kaczynski would trade for food, then resell that food to other prisoners at a markup, making cigarette profit that he'd reinvest in more trades. He was running a business inside a death camp because running that business gave him a reason to wake up, a sense of control, and actual additional calories that improved his chances of survival. But this economy was built on horror. The cigarettes that gave some prisoners hope came at the cost of others. When a prisoner died, which happened constantly, other prisoners would immediately search the body for anything valuable. Cigarettes hidden in clothes, bread tucked in pockets, anything tradable. It was survival cannibalism of a different kind, economic rather than literal, but driven by the same desperate need to live even if it meant profiting from the dead. The concentration camp cigarette economy also created brutal hierarchies. Prisoners with access to cigarettes had more power than prisoners without. That power dynamic played out in vicious ways. A prisoner with cigarettes could buy information about upcoming selections, giving them time to appear healthier or hide. A prisoner without cigarettes went into selections blind, with no preparation, higher chance of being chosen for the gas chambers. The gap between life and death was measured in tobacco. Some prisoners became so desperate for cigarettes they'd trade future food rations. I'll give you my next 3 bread rations for 1 cigarette now. This was insanity. It meant slow starvation. But nicotine addiction doesn't care about logic, and neither does the crushing psychological need for anything that provides a brief moment of comfort when every moment is agony. Those trades happened. Those trades happened, and the prisoners who made them usually died within weeks, malnourished and broken, while the prisoner who got the bread rations lived a little longer. The guards and SS officers profited enormously from the cigarette economy. They could confiscate cigarettes from new prisoners arriving at the camps, then trade those cigarettes back to prisoners for valuables. Gold jewelry, family heirlooms, anything valuable. The items would then be sold to German civilians or kept for personal use. It was state-sponsored theft disguised as trade, where the currency was cigarettes and the exchange rates were dictated at gunpoint. There's a specific kind of evil in creating an economy based on nicotine addiction inside a facility designed to murder people, because it gave prisoners false hope. It created the illusion that if you just played the game right, if you saved enough cigarettes, if you made the right trades, you could survive. Some did. Most didn't. And the ones who didn't often died clutching a few saved cigarettes, worthless in the end because you can't smoke your way out of a gas chamber. After the war, survivors talked about the cigarette economy with mixed emotions. Some credited it with keeping them alive, giving them a purpose and a system to game. Others saw it as one more layer of degradation, one more way the Nazis stripped humanity and turned human beings into desperate economic actors, willing to do anything for a drag of nicotine. Both perspectives are true, because economic systems aren't good or evil by themselves. They're just tools. And in the concentration camps, Cigarette money was a tool that saved some lives and corrupted many more. The prisoners who survived the camps and wrote about their experiences often included stories about cigarette trading, not because they were proud of it, but because it was central to survival. And when those stories spread, when economists and historians studied them alongside Radford's POW camp research, a darker picture emerged. Cigarettes had become currency not just in POW camps, but across the entire collapsed economy of wartime Europe. And after Germany surrendered in 1945, that cigarette economy didn't disappear. It got bigger. Frontline economics. Before prisoners created cigarette economies behind barbed wire, soldiers were already trading smokes in foxholes and trenches. The front lines of World War II were places where traditional military logistics broke down constantly. Supply trucks got blown up, convoys got delayed, parachute drops landed in enemy territory, and soldiers, stuck in mud and blood waiting for the next artillery barrage, created their own economic systems to cope. Every American soldier received 12 cigarettes per day in their K rations. That was official, but reality was messier. Some days you got your full ration, other days supplies didn't arrive and you got nothing. Some units had generous supply sergeants who handed out extra cartons. Other units had corrupt supply sergeants who sold cigarettes on the side and kept the profits. The inconsistency created opportunity for anyone willing to trade. Soldiers who didn't smoke immediately recognized they were sitting on gold. Those 12 daily cigarettes, assuming they actually arrived, added up to 84 cigarettes per week. That was more than 4 packs, enough to buy serious favors from other soldiers. Need someone to take your guard shift so you can sleep? 3 cigarettes. Want a hot meal instead of cold rations? 5 cigarettes. Need someone to write a letter home for you because you're barely literate? 2 cigarettes, and the guy would make it sound romantic enough to keep your girl from dumping you. Combat troops especially understood cigarette value because combat created scarcity. When you're pinned down by machine gun fire for 3 days straight, nobody's delivering fresh cigarette rations. The smokes you had were the smokes you had, period. Prices skyrocketed. A cigarette that cost nothing yesterday because supply was good now cost half your chocolate ration because supply disappeared. Soldiers learned fast to save cigarettes as insurance against the inevitable supply breakdowns. Some soldiers ran entire black market operations from the front lines. They'd stockpile cigarettes during quiet periods, then sell them at markup during combat pushes when everyone was desperate. It was war profiteering, technically illegal under military regulations, but enforcement was impossible when officers were too busy trying not to die. And honestly, many officers participated themselves. A lieutenant could trade cigarettes to enlisted men for better positions in the trench, cleaner gear, first pick of captured supplies. Rank gave you power, but cigarettes gave you influence. Interactions with local civilians turned cigarettes into universal currency faster than any government policy could have. When American troops rolled through French villages in 1944, French civilians didn't want dollars. The franc was unstable. Nobody knew if banks would honor paper money. And besides, what were you going to buy with money when all the stores were bombed out? But cigarettes? Cigarettes could be smoked, traded, or sold to someone else. They had immediate, obvious value. French farmers would trade eggs, milk, bread, even wine for cigarettes. A pack of Lucky Strikes could buy dinner for 4. A carton could buy shelter for a week. American soldiers lived like kings in some villages purely because they had access to tobacco that French civilians couldn't get anywhere else. The soldiers learned to carry extra cigarettes specifically for civilian interaction, knowing it was the best form of local currency. The same pattern repeated across Europe. Italian civilians in 1943 traded food for cigarettes. German civilians in 1945, after the surrender, literally begged American GIs for cigarettes because the German economy had completely collapsed and cigarettes were the only functioning currency left. An American private with a carton of cigarettes could trade for German cameras, watches, jewelry, artwork, anything portable and valuable. The official exchange rate said $1 bought 10 Reichsmarks. The real exchange rate, played out in street trades, said 1 cigarette bought whatever you could negotiate because cigarettes actually worked as money. In the Pacific Theater, interactions with locals were more complicated because of language barriers and active combat zones, but cigarettes still dominated trade. Filipino resistance fighters helping American troops didn't want cash. They wanted cigarettes, ammunition, and medicine in that order. The cigarettes could be traded throughout the islands for food and supplies. They were more useful than American dollars, which couldn't buy anything in a war zone jungle. Japanese soldiers, on the rare occasions they were captured or traded with during temporary truces to collect wounded, also recognized cigarette value. American cigarettes specifically became prized because they were better quality than Japanese military tobacco, which was harsh and poorly processed. A captured Japanese soldier might trade information for American cigarettes, not because he was a traitor, but because those cigarettes could be used to bribe guards or trade with other prisoners. The currency crossed enemy lines because human need is universal. Even between Allied forces, cigarettes were the default trade medium. British troops and American troops had different supplies and different preferences. Americans had better cigarettes and more chocolate. Brits had better tea and wool blankets. Trades happened constantly, and they were priced in cigarettes because cigarettes were the one thing both forces had, understood, and valued consistently. "I'll trade you my tea ration for 10 cigarettes," was a common negotiation in any base where Allied forces mixed. The military tried to control cigarette trading with regulations that forbade selling rations, but enforcement was a joke. How do you stop trades in foxholes? You can't. How do you prevent soldiers from giving cigarettes to civilians? You can't. The best the military could do was make sure supply kept flowing so that at least prices stayed stable. When cigarette supplies dried up, soldier morale collapsed because they lost their informal economic system and their coping mechanism at the same time. Officers who understood this became better leaders. They'd make sure cigarette supplies got distributed fairly, even if it meant pulling rank to prevent supply sergeants from hoarding. They'd look the other way when soldiers traded cigarettes for small comforts because they knew those comforts kept men sane under insane conditions. And they'd keep personal stashes of cigarettes specifically to reward soldiers for good work, creating an informal bonus system that worked better than medals or praise. By 1945, as the war in Europe ended, American soldiers occupying Germany found themselves sitting on economic gold mines. They had regular cigarette rations. Germans had nothing. The exchange rate was absurd. One cigarette could buy a full meal. One pack could buy a watch. One carton could buy a camera or a piece of jewelry worth hundreds of dollars. Soldiers started mailing stuff home, valuables bought with subsidized military cigarettes, making more money from trades than from their official pay. The military eventually caught on and tried to crack down, but it was too late. Millions of cigarettes had flooded into the German black market, creating an entire shadow economy that would last for years. And that economy, born in the front lines and prison camps, would become the defining feature of post-war Germany's desperate struggle to survive. Post-war Germany's cigarette economy. May 1945. Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Cities lay in ruins. Millions were dead. And the survivors faced a new nightmare. The total collapse of normal life. Food was scarce, shelter was scarce, medicine was scarce, and money, the German Reichsmark, was worthless. The government that issued it no longer existed. The banks that backed it were blown apart. Inflation had destroyed any remaining value. You could have 1,000,000 Reichsmarks and still starve because nobody would trade food for paper. Into this chaos came the American occupation forces. Soldiers in clean uniforms, well-fed, healthy, carrying packs of cigarettes in their pockets. Every American GI received a ration of 2 cartons per month, about 12 cigarettes per day, sold at the military post exchange for deeply discounted prices. The cigarettes cost the soldiers almost nothing. To German civilians, those same cigarettes were worth everything. The cigarette economy that had developed in POW camps and front lines now exploded across an entire country. Within weeks of the surrender, cigarettes became the de facto currency of Germany. Prices for every good and service were quoted in cigarettes. A loaf of bread cost 5 cigarettes. A pound of butter cost 30 cigarettes. Rent for a room cost a carton per month. Cigarettes replaced the Reichsmark so completely that even government officials started accepting them for taxes and fees. The black market became the real market. Official ration systems set up by the Allied occupation forces couldn't provide enough food to keep people alive. Everyone had ration cards, little pieces of paper that entitled you to fixed amounts of bread, milk, meat. But the rations were inadequate, sometimes less than 1,000 calories per day. You could follow the official system perfectly and still slowly starve. So people turned to the black market where food was available if you had cigarettes to pay for it. American soldiers realized fast that they were sitting on fortunes. A carton of cigarettes that cost them maybe $1 at the PX could be sold to Germans for 2,000 Reichsmarks. Those Reichsmarks, nearly worthless for buying things directly, could be exchanged at official rates for dollars at absurd ratios. Or better yet, soldiers could skip the Reichsmark step entirely and trade cigarettes directly for German valuables. Cameras, watches, artwork, antiques, anything portable. The math was straightforward and brutal. A soldier making $150 per month in military pay could easily make $12,000 per year by selling his cigarette ration on the German black market. That's $1,000 per month, almost 7 times his official salary, just from trading subsidized American tobacco. And that was for soldiers who smoked some of their ration. Soldiers who didn't smoke at all or who bought extra cigarettes from other soldiers could make even more. Vladimir Petrov, an economist who studied Allied currency operations, calculated these numbers and was shocked. The American military was accidentally running the largest arbitrage operation in history. They bought cigarettes at subsidized prices in the US, shipped them to soldiers in Germany for pennies, and those soldiers sold them at 1,000% markups to desperate civilians. It was free money, and every soldier with half a brain took advantage. The Germans adapted to cigarette currency with remarkable speed. Shops displayed prices in cigarettes instead of Reichsmarks. Employers paid workers in cigarettes. Landlords collected rent in cigarettes. Prostitutes charged in cigarettes. Doctors accepted cigarettes for medical treatment. The entire economy reorganized around tobacco because tobacco was the only thing that held value consistently. Even people who didn't smoke carried cigarettes because they needed money, and cigarettes were money. This created strange scenes in occupied Germany. You'd see a grandmother who never smoked in her life carefully counting out cigarettes to pay for bread at a bakery. You'd see businessmen in threadbare suits negotiating contracts where payment was specified in cartons, not cash. You'd see children running errands for a single cigarette as payment, then trading that cigarette to their parents who needed it to buy dinner. The whole country was running on smoke. The black market had physical locations, street corners, and squares where traders gathered. Frankfurt had several famous black market zones where you could trade anything for anything as long as you had cigarettes to make deals happen. American soldiers would show up with cartons looking to buy cameras or watches to send home. German civilians would show up with family heirlooms looking to buy food. Middlemen would broker deals, taking a cigarette or two as commission. It was organized chaos, technically illegal, but absolutely essential for survival. Allied authorities tried to shut down the black markets with raids and arrests, but it was pointless. You can't arrest an entire country, and you can't stop economic activity that's literally keeping millions of people alive. The occupation forces eventually gave up on enforcement and focused instead on trying to stabilize cigarette supply so prices wouldn't swing wildly and cause riots. The cigarette economy created a new social hierarchy in post-war Germany. The wealthy were people with access to cigarettes, American soldiers, obviously, but also Germans who worked for the occupation forces, translators, cooks, drivers, secretaries. These people got paid partly in cigarettes or had access to American PX stores where they could buy cigarettes cheap. They lived well while their neighbors starved. The poor were Germans with no connections to Americans and no way to get cigarettes except through expensive black market purchases. Old people on pensions found their life savings, paid in Reichsmarks, were now worth less than a single cigarette. Widows whose husbands died in the war had nothing to trade and no income. They begged on streets or sold their bodies for cigarettes that could be traded for food. It was economic brutality on a scale Germany hadn't seen since the hyperinflation of the 1920s. Some Germans became professional cigarette traders, running sophisticated operations. They'd buy cigarettes from soldiers at slightly above PX prices, but below black market prices. Then they'd transport the cigarettes to other cities where supply was lower and prices were higher. They'd sell at markup and pocket the difference. It was interstate commerce powered by tobacco arbitrage. Some of these traders became wealthy, accumulating enough cigarettes and goods to later convert into real money when Germany finally stabilized. The cigarette economy had strange effects on German industry. Factories that had been bombed during the war started rebuilding, but they couldn't pay workers in Reichsmarks because Reichsmarks were worthless. So they paid in cigarettes. Workers would show up, do their shifts, and get paid in cartons at the end of the week. Those cartons would immediately get traded for food, rent, clothes, everything. The factories had to secure cigarette supplies the same way they had to secure raw materials. No cigarettes meant no workers, meant no production. This system lasted for 3 years, from 1945 to 1948, 3 years where an entire country ran on cigarettes instead of money. It only ended when the Allies introduced a new currency, the Deutsche Mark, in June 1948. The currency reform was carefully planned and executed overnight. Every German received 40 new marks. Old Reichsmarks were converted at terrible rates or declared worthless entirely. And most importantly, the new marks were backed by Allied economic power and tight monetary controls that prevented inflation. Within days, the cigarette economy started collapsing. Shops that had priced everything in cigarettes suddenly switched to pricing in marks. Why? Because the marks worked. They held value, they were scarce and controlled, and everyone accepted them. The cigarette black market didn't disappear immediately, but it shrank fast as normal commerce returned. Germans could buy food with marks from official stores at reasonable prices, so they stopped needing black market cigarettes. American soldiers saw their cigarette fortunes evaporate. A carton that could buy a camera last month could now buy maybe a bottle of beer. The arbitrage opportunity closed because the fundamental reason it existed, the lack of functional currency, had been solved. Some soldiers who'd been planning to retire on black market profits found themselves holding cartons of cigarettes that were suddenly worth face value again. They'd missed the window. But the psychological damage lasted longer than the economy. Germans who lived through the cigarette economy remembered it as a time when everything they thought was stable, money, society, civilization, disappeared. They remembered trading family heirlooms for food. They remembered seeing American soldiers with more wealth in their pockets from tobacco than German professionals earned in years. And they remembered that in the absolute worst conditions, humans always find a way to create economic systems, even if those systems run on addiction and desperation. The cigarette economy of post-war Germany became a case study for economists trying to understand how currencies emerge. It proved that money doesn't require government backing if the medium has the right properties. It proved that humans will adopt commodity currencies when fiat currencies fail, and it proved that in economic collapse, anything with universal demand and limited supply can become money, whether governments like it or not. The psychology of cigarette money. The story of cigarette currency in World War II isn't just about economics. It's about human psychology under extreme pressure, about how people think when survival isn't guaranteed, about what happens when all the normal rules collapse and you have to rebuild society from nothing with whatever materials you have on hand. And what the cigarette economy revealed is both inspiring and deeply disturbing. First, there's the fact that this happened at all. Nobody planned cigarette currency. No government authorized it. No economist designed it. It emerged naturally from thousands of individual humans making rational decisions about how to get what they needed to survive. That's called spontaneous order. And it's one of the most powerful concepts in economic theory. The idea that complex systems can organize themselves without central control if the incentives are right. In the POW camps, the incentive was obvious: stay alive. To stay alive, you needed food, warmth, medicine, information, anything that improved your odds, but you couldn't get those things through normal channels because normal channels didn't exist. So you traded, And when trading got complicated, you adopted a common medium of exchange. It wasn't genius, it wasn't philosophy, it was practical problem solving by desperate people. But here's the psychological twist. Cigarettes worked as currency partly because they destroyed themselves. Every time someone smoked a cigarette, that cigarette permanently left the economy. This meant cigarettes were naturally deflationary. Their value increased over time as supply decreased. In normal economies, deflation is bad because it encourages hoarding and discourages spending. But in POW camps, deflation was good because it gave saved cigarettes more purchasing power, rewarding the discipline of not smoking. This created a brutal psychological divide between smokers and non smokers. Non smokers could watch smokers slowly destroy their own wealth and feel superior, feel smart, feel like they were winning the game. Smokers knew they were losing, but couldn't stop because nicotine addiction is stronger than willpower for most people. The psychological toll of watching yourself smoke away your survival chances must have been crushing. But the alternative, nicotine withdrawal in a prison camp where stress was already maximal, felt worse in the moment. The traders, the guys who ran arbitrage operations buying low and selling high, developed a different psychology. They stopped seeing cigarettes as cigarettes and started seeing them purely as currency units. To them, a cigarette wasn't something you smoked. It was 10 minutes of labor or half a tin of jam or whatever the current market price dictated. This cognitive shift, treating money as abstract numbers rather than physical objects with intrinsic use, is how professional investors think. And these prison camp traders were essentially running investment portfolios with cigarettes as their assets. Some prisoners developed elaborate accounting systems, tracking every cigarette earned and spent. They'd write down trades in makeshift ledgers, calculating their net cigarette worth, like bankers calculating account balances. This gave them psychological control in a situation where control was otherwise impossible. You couldn't control when the war would end. You couldn't control whether parcels would arrive. You couldn't control if you'd be transferred or killed. But you could control your cigarette savings. And that control mattered enormously for mental health. The psychology in concentration camps was darker. There, cigarettes represented not just economic advantage, but moral compromise. To get cigarettes, you often had to do things that violated your own ethics: work as a capo and oppress fellow prisoners, steal from the dead, inform on others to guards. The cigarettes became psychological weights, physical reminders of what you'd done to survive. Some survivors later said they could never smoke again after liberation because the smell reminded them of choices they wished they hadn't made. The guards who accepted cigarette bribes experienced their own psychological journey. At first, accepting a cigarette for a small favor probably felt harmless. Uh, just helping someone out, no big deal. But over time, as the bribes got bigger and the favors got more significant, the guards became complicit in an economic system that undermined their own authority. They were supposed to enforce the camp rules, but they'd take cigarettes to ignore the rules. The cognitive dissonance must have been significant, though probably not as significant as their desire for tobacco. After the war, in occupied Germany, cigarettes created psychological distortions at a national scale. Germans who'd lived through the cigarette economy developed different attitudes about money than people who lived through normal economic conditions. They learned that official currency can become worthless overnight. They learned that tangible goods hold value better than paper promises. And they learned that the people with access to commodities, not the people with cash savings, survive economic collapse. This led behavioral changes that lasted generations. Germans who lived through the cigarette economy became savers and hoarders. They didn't trust banks as much. They kept physical assets, gold, jewelry, foreign currency, at home. They taught their children to never assume money will work tomorrow just because it works today. The trauma of watching money fail created a cultural psychology of preparation and skepticism that shaped German economic behavior for decades. American soldiers who profited from cigarette trading developed their own psychological patterns. Some felt guilty, recognizing they'd exploited desperate people. Others felt pride, thinking they'd been clever entrepreneurs. Many compartmentalized, telling themselves that everyone was doing it, so it must be okay. The military didn't help because official policy pretended the black market didn't exist, while unofficially everyone knew it was massive. That moral ambiguity lets soldiers rationalize their participation without confronting the ethics. The most fascinating psychological element is how quickly people adapted to cigarette currency and how quickly they abandoned it. When the Deutsche Mark was introduced in 1948, Germans switched to using marks within days. Decades of using gold backed currency, years of using cigarettes, all forgotten instantly because the new marks worked better. Human psychology is remarkably flexible when it comes to money. We'll use whatever works and we'll switch as soon as something better appears. Loyalty to currency is based entirely on utility, not sentiment. This adaptability is why economists study the cigarette economy so intensely. It proves that money is a social construct, something humans create through mutual agreement. It proves that under the right conditions, anything can be money. And it proves that the properties that make good money, durability, divisibility, portability, scarcity, are more important than government backing or historical tradition. If something has those properties and people need it, it will become currency, whether authorities like it or not. The psychological lesson for modern economics is profound. We live in an age where most money is digital. Numbers in computers backed by nothing except collective faith in institutions. What happens if that faith breaks? What happens if a major war or disaster destroys banking systems? The World War II cigarette economy suggests that humans will immediately create new money from whatever resources are available. It might be cigarettes again, or bottled water, or ammunition, or medical supplies, but it will be something because humans can't function without economic exchange, and exchange can't function efficiently without money. The prisoners who lived through cigarette economies and later became economists like Radford understood this better than anyone. They'd seen money emerge from nothing in real time. They'd watched complex financial systems develop in prison camps without any central authority. And they knew that economic theory wasn't just abstract academic nonsense. It was a description of real human behavior under real pressure. The equations and models that economists teach in universities came from observations of people trading cigarettes to stay alive in German prison camps. There's something both beautiful and horrifying about that. Beautiful because it shows human resilience, our ability to create order from chaos and find solutions to impossible problems. Horrifying because it shows how easily we adapt to brutal circumstances, how quickly we normalize trading tobacco for survival, and how thin the veneer of civilization really is when pressure gets applied. The cigarette economy was a monument to human ingenuity and a warning about how fast society can collapse. And here's the final psychological truth. The men who used cigarettes as currency, whether in POW camps, concentration camps, or occupied Germany, were just people. Not heroes, not villains, just humans trying to survive. They didn't choose the situation. They didn't want to live in a world where cigarettes were more valuable than money. But when that world arrived, they adapted. They created systems. They made it work. And then when the crisis ended and normal currency returned, they adapted again. That adaptability is what defines humans. We're not the strongest species or the fastest or the toughest, but we're the most flexible. We can live in any environment, survive any disaster, and rebuild from any collapse. And if that means run an entire economy on cigarettes for a few years until something better comes along, then that's what we'll do. Without hesitation, without apology, because survival doesn't wait for perfect solutions. It demands whatever works right now. And in World War II, what worked was smoke. The cigarette economy of World War II eventually faded into history. The POW camps got liberated, the concentration camps were closed, their horrors exposed to a world that could barely comprehend what had happened. Occupied Germany recovered, rebuilt, and eventually became one of the world's strongest economies. The soldiers went home, some with fortunes earned from cigarette trading, others with just their memories and trauma. But the lessons remained. Written in economic textbooks, taught in universities, studied by policymakers who needed to understand how currencies work when normal systems fail. R.A. Radford's paper about the POW camp economy became required reading for economics students. The story of post-war Germany's cigarette years became a case study in monetary reform. And the dark tales from concentration camps became reminders of how economic systems can exist even in hell itself. Today, cigarettes still occasionally function as currency in closed systems. American prisons use them for trade until authorities ban them for health reasons. Then prisoners switch to ramen noodles or postage stamps. Disaster zones sometimes see cigarette economies emerge when official currency fails. Anywhere humans are trapped without working money, commodity currencies appear like clockwork because the fundamental truth revealed by World War II hasn't changed. Money is whatever people agree money is. And when people need money but don't have it, they'll create it from whatever resources they have available. In 1945, those resources were cigarettes. In future crises, it'll be something else. But the pattern will repeat because the pattern is built into human psychology, into our need to trade, our need for fairness in exchange, and our remarkable ability to create complex systems from simple tools. The men who traded cigarettes in POW camps are mostly gone now, dead from old age, their stories fading. The survivors of concentration camp cigarette economies carry scars that never fully heal. The American GIs who made fortunes in occupied Germany went on to live normal lives, most never telling their children about the black market deals that funded their first houses or businesses. The history is slipping away, but the economics remain. Documented, analyzed, understood. The cigarette economy of World War II proved that money doesn't come from governments. It comes from humans, from our collective agreement about value, from our desperate need to exchange goods and services even under the worst conditions imaginable. And it proved that in the end, when everything else is stripped away, humans will always find a way to create order, build systems, and survive, even if survival means treating cigarettes as more valuable than gold.